second part of my lecture has to do specifically with how we speak into a pluralist society, or the Christian ethics in the context of a pluralist society. In his Confession, St. Augustine expresses his shame at the fact that he wept at his mother's funeral, as well as the funeral of his boyhood friend. And the reason why he felt shame at expressing grief was because at that time in his life he was still deeply influenced by a Stoic view of the universe. And in the Stoic universe, cultivating one's own virtue was paramount. It was of supreme importance. And cultivating one's virtue was identified with happiness, or what the Greeks called eudaimonia. And virtue required freedom from emotional disturbances, such as sorrow, worry, anxiety, fear. One Stoic philosopher, Seneca, writes, and this sums up the Stoic view, at all events the mind must be withdrawn from all externals into itself. Let it trust in itself, rejoice in itself, esteem its own possessions, retreat as much as it can from things not its own, devote itself to itself, feel no damage. And this was a view that many Aristotelians also believed in. Yes, you care for others, but the caring for others is with a view to one's own well-being, one's own flourishing in virtue. So a modern-day Aristotelian by the name of Alasdair MacIntyre expresses this view. He writes, "What constitutes a good reason for my doing this rather than that? For my acting from this particular desire rather than that? Is that my doing this rather than that serves my good, will contribute to my flourishing qua human being." Now, as Augustine immersed himself more and more in the Christian scriptures, he came to make a radical break with the Stoic, Neoplatonist, and Aristotelian views of virtue. He saw that grief and virtue are not incompatible. In fact, grief is often the affective side of virtue. Our tendency to worry over the mental and physical well-being of family and friends, to weep at funerals and the like, this is not to be ascribed to our fallenness, but it's part of our created human nature. So later in life, in one of his later books called The City of God, he writes, "The more friends we have, the more places we have them in, the further and more widely do we fear that some evil may befall them out of all the mass of the evils of this world. And when such things do happen, and the fact is brought to our knowledge, who save one who has experienced the same thing can understand the burning sorrow which then afflicts our hearts?" And in that same section he also writes, "When we contemplate or see people in this condition, and when we consider their plight fully, we can hardly refrain from weeping. Perhaps we cannot do so at all. And we should not try, because we are created in bonds of solidarity with other human beings." So Augustine's embrace of the moral vision of Scripture led him not only to break with the agent-centered moral orientation of the Stoic and the Aristotelian, but also with their conception of the good life, understood as a life that is lived well. The moral vision of Scripture speaks a good deal about living one's life well in whatever one's circumstances. But it also speaks of what it is for one's life to go well and not to go well. my flourishing as a human being is not and cannot be entirely in my own hands, because my well-being is constituted in good measure by the actions and the restraints from action of others. It is in their hands. So well-being is intrinsically social in a way that it is not for the eudaemonist. Professor Nicholas Wolterstorff has argued that a theory of inherent natural human rights cannot come out of a Stoic or Aristotelian understanding of virtue. He writes, rights decenter the agent. Instead of the agent's happiness determining his action, the worth of the recipient and of how those others who will be affected by the action is to determine what the agent does. So there are three instructive lessons that I draw from this. Firstly, that all moral concepts have to be interpreted within specific moral traditions and worldviews. So, for example, a Buddhist, like a Stoic, may also use the language of compassion. But compassion in Buddhism is more about radiating benevolent thoughts to all living beings. It is not to be affected by the actions of others, but to, in a detached way, help others. That's very different from a Christian understanding of compassion, which has to do with empathy, entering into the feelings of others, and even feeling the sorrow and the anxiety and the fears that they experience. Or the concept of self-denial in Buddhism is an ontological concept. The self is not really real. Whereas in Christianity, self-denial is a moral concept. It is putting the other's well-being before oneself, or handing over oneself to God to be redirected towards the purposes of God. One great scholar of Buddhism called Edward Conzer wrote, I once read through a collection of the lives of Roman Catholic saints, and there was not one of whom a Buddhist would fully approve. They were bad Buddhists, though good Christians. And the other way around. But those who are considered good Buddhists may not be very attractive people from a Christian perspective. And also what we consider natural is not something neutral, but it's shaped by moral traditions and the worldviews that we interact. But secondly, the example of Augustine shows us that conversion from one moral tradition or worldview to another is possible. And this happens when we encounter people who see the world very differently to us. And either they force us to rethink what we believe and why we believe what we believe, and then our thinking, our values are reinforced, or we come to feel that yes, this other way of looking at the world makes more sense. It's more plausible, it's more attractive. And so we convert to another tradition or worldview. My third observation is that much that is taken for granted in modern Western society is parasitic on earlier Judeo-Christian traditions of thinking. For example, the whole concept of natural human rights, which, as Wolterstorff says, could never have emerged from Stoic or Aristotelian ways of thinking, but has a Jewish and Christian provenance. At the same time, Roger Trigg, a British philosopher, notes the language of equality, non-discrimination, and human rights in general fills a vacuum left, at least in Europe, by the decay of institutional Christianity. It can be proclaimed with a kind of dogmatism associated with the worst elements of religion, with little appeal to reason or justification. So you ask people, why do you believe? that a Down syndrome child is equal in dignity, should be treated as of equal value to a Beethoven or an Einstein, how would they answer? So there are two questions that I want to address in this lecture. What kind of democratic polity should we be seeking in pluralist societies? And secondly, how should the church interact in the public sphere in such societies? Some of us can choose where we live, but we usually cannot choose with whom we live. We belong to societies, we don't merely live in them. And societies are neither hotels nor airport transit lounges where strangers brush past each other using common facilities that others have built for their individual journeys. They are more like homes that we build together, in the words of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Sachs goes on to declare, what we build should be the central topic of the democratic conversation. A conversation scored for many voices, covering many subjects, but unified around the question, what kind of society do we seek to create for the sake of our children and grandchildren not yet born? Isn't it an illusion to think that we can have a democratic society based purely on constitutions and formal procedures and not pay any attention to the moral formation of its individual citizens? The kind of people we are and become shapes the kind of society we have. But it's also true that the kind of society we live in shapes what kind of human beings we become. Honesty and integrity are the presupposition of public life. They are not the product. The parties to an agreement must already have a sense of what is right and a willingness to abide by it, even when it goes against their own economic interests. A contract is no contract at all if it is kept only when it is convenient for me to do so. Also, if elected representatives and officials cannot be trusted to be concerned with our interests, then faith in democracy will wither. The Canadian thinker Charles Taylor reminds us that democratic societies require a much higher level of solidarity and mutual commitment to one another in joint political projects than authoritarian or despotic societies. He writes, citizens have to do for themselves, as it were, what otherwise the rulers would do for them. But this will only happen if these citizens feel a strong bond of identification with their political community, and hence with those who share with them in this. So moral outrage, feeling moral outrage at the unjust suffering of others, and a sense of human solidarity are paradoxically the assumptions on which a liberal democracy rests. Personal character counts, and there are some secularist and religious traditions that frankly do not encourage the kind of moral character that encourages a sense of outrage at the suffering of innocent others, or that values social justice. 2 or 3 decades ago, a famous Indian sociologist called Rajni Kothari wrote a letter to the Times of India, a prominent Indian newspaper. And in that letter he lamented, and I quote from it, "As I talk to my friends, my relatives, my professional colleagues today, I get a feeling of total ignorance of the other India, when in fact they are forced to take note, such as when they walk through the pavements on which people are sleeping. There is a feeling of revulsion, of rejection, of contempt, not of compassion, empathy, and least of all, any sense of guilt." That is why every movement for social transformation in history has had some kind of transcendental, indeed theistic engine. Now, these are not popular things to say in academic and political circles today, but they need to be said if we care for truth and integrity. Towards pluralist citizenship. In a society that's dominated by one culture, tolerance for other communities is not enough to sustain respect for cultural diversity. In every society, the public realm enjoys greater prestige than the private realm. Although other cultures are allowed to flourish in the private realm, they exist in the shadow of the dominant culture, which may receive state support and greater access to valuable resources. They are largely seen as marginal, and they are worth practicing only in the relative privacy of the family and communal or community associations. So many young people from these minority cultures will face enormous pressure to assimilate to the dominant culture, or else they internalize their inferior status and they retreat into ghettos, and these then become breeding grounds for violence. It's a principal task of government to balance the various claims of individuals, for example, their civil liberties, their civil rights, and those of associations and communities. Also, it is the task of government to weigh multicultural claims against the wider claim of the public good, such as social cohesion. There is no single formula or procedure that can be applied mechanically to every society. Every multicultural society needs to devise its own political structure that suits its history, its moral traditions, and the range and depth of diversity within it. A common public culture is not one in which everyone believes the same thing, but one in which everyone has equal status in cooperatively determining a way of life in common. A common public culture cannot be imposed by the state or by the dominant cultural community. It can only come from below, through processes of dialogue and negotiation and compromise. But one of the important functions of the state at both local and national levels is to encourage the conditions that make such conversations and negotiations possible. Some of these conditions are legislative. For example, equal protection for all under the law, or official recognition of minority languages. But most will have to do with the way that civil society institutions function. For example, a fair and responsible mass media to which all members of all communities have access, or public schools and universities where people from all communities can freely interact with one another. This leads me to consider the whole area of faith and public reasoning. Debates about the role of religion in public life are context sensitive. In Europe, multiculturalism and religious diversity are interwoven with the politics of immigration, especially from former colonies since the 1950s and 1960s. European political liberalism has been forced to question its own commitment to multiculturalism in view of the increasing Islamic presence. An illiberal version of liberalism is threatening to emerge, one which aggressively seeks to outlaw all religious speech and the public display of religious symbols, as well as refusing to acknowledge the huge Christian contribution to the making of liberal institutions and the European identity itself. By contrast, debates that rage in the Indian subcontinent have to do with the changing identities and political claims of people who speak different languages, observe different faith traditions, and who have occupied well-defined territorial spaces for many hundreds of years. So there's a wholly different flavor to the debates, even though the same political terms such as secularism, pluralism, equality, and so on are employed. It's to the German social thinker Jürgen Habermas that we owe the commonplace usage of the term the public sphere or the public square. The public sphere is a common space where members of a society meet to discuss common interests and come to a common mind. The media of exchange can be various. It can be face-to-face, print, electronic, and so on. Habermas offered a genealogy in which the 18th century European literary public sphere informed the development of a public sphere of rational critical debate that gave individuals in civil society a way to influence politics. In Habermas's story, religion was discounted. But a less narrow-minded genealogy will point out that the language of liberty was nurtured in the early modern period in European cities and in the New England townships of the American colonies by congregations of Protestant dissenters, most notably Calvinists and Puritans. Public reasoning is reasoning that is oriented towards the discernment of the public good. Christians should seek to multiply the voices that are involved in such public conversations, not to reduce their number. And in every community, ethnic or religious, it is customary for women, the disabled, and those who are not well educated to be either ignored or deliberately silenced. It's important that those who are most affected by an issue under consideration be provided the space to make their voice heard. Since decisions about law or public policy in a liberal democracy have to command the consent of people who hold a wide range of moral traditions, who indwell a wide range of worldviews, simply quoting a particular religious authority, whether the Bible or the Quran or the Pope, will not persuade others in a pluralist environment. So influential philosophers such as John Rawls and Habermas himself have claimed, especially in their earlier writings, that political legitimacy in a liberal democracy requires that public debate or public deliberation be conducted in a common secular language. As citizens deliberate together, they are best guided, according to Rawls, by what he calls a political conception of justice that they can all endorse, and by what he calls a public reason, meaning that they only present concepts and arguments that other reasonable citizens find intelligible, even if they may disagree. If they try to introduce reasons that are grounded in their own worldviews and moral traditions, what he calls comprehensive doctrines, parts of those will not be translatable into reasons to which other people who do not share those worldviews would accept. Now, Rawls understood this as a duty of civility that followed from the legitimacy of the liberal democratic state. A public reason so defined will thus be one that makes sense to any reasonable citizen, and that is open to examination by any such citizen, regardless of their moral or religious traditions. It enjoys the status of a universal Esperanto that everybody understands and can argue in, while theological or religious concepts and arguments can only be presented by invoking some religious text or a mystical experience, and so these become sectarian, obscurantist, and they lack any rational basis. So let me give you one example from Barack Obama. This was before he became president. Obama writes, democracy demands that the religiously motivated translate their concerns into universal rather than religion-specific values. It requires that their proposals be subject to argument and amenable to reason. I may be opposed to abortion for religious reasons, but if I seek to pass a law banning its practice, I cannot simply point to the teachings of my church or evoke God's will. I have to explain why abortion violates some principle that is acceptable to people of all faiths, including those with no faith at all. However, in a participatory democracy, we need to be open to our fellow citizens concerning the deep sources of how they think about moral and political issues. And people often want to know what our faith convictions are, just as we need to learn from others what they think are important, which may even be a challenge to us. So Rawls and his followers, like Obama, seem to be excluding the possibility of people being fundamentally challenged by others and even being persuaded by the merits of another's position, even when they are not presented in terms with which we are or they are familiar. Christopher Ebel reminds us that from an epistemological point of view, what is rational for a citizen to believe depends crucially on the testimony of others in her society. He observes, I quote, we form most of our beliefs and also most of our background beliefs by depending on the unchecked trustworthiness of others. And it's by relying on those beliefs that we are able to arrive at a rational evaluation of other beliefs, unquote. So it was considered rational, it was common sense to believe in the Germany of the 1930s that Jews were a subhuman, or at least an inferior human species. And the only counter to this were religious arguments, such as those embodied in the Barmen Declaration, which drew on particular comprehensive doctrines. So it's a strangely restricted pluralism and a constrained notion of political debate that people like Rawls works with, not one that genuinely recognizes diversity and the depth of our differences. Professor Robert George, who is a professor of jurisprudence at Princeton University, has given a very interesting argument concerning abortion and non-therapeutic embryonic stem cell research. And his argument goes like this. We are all human animals. The vast majority of us, all those who are not the products of monozygotic twinning, that is, twinning from a single fertilized egg, began our lives at conception. Each of us was once an embryo, just as each of us was once an adolescent, a child, an infant, and a fetus. So from a scientific point of view, there is no doubt at all concerning what the early embryo is. The early human embryo is a human being at the earliest stage of his or her development. Not a potential human being, not a pre-human being, or a mass of cells or mere tissue, but an individual member of the species Homo sapiens. As modern embryology confirms beyond any possibility of doubt, we were never mere parts of our mothers. We were from the beginning complete self-integrating organisms that developed to maturity by a gradual, gapless, and self-directed process. The embryo is a new human being, the same self-directing human organism as the later child and adult. The changes from embryo to fetus, to infant, to adolescent, to adult are merely changes in degree of natural development of the same individual. Now that's the science. Where moral reasoning enters is in the following argument. If we accept that human beings are intrinsically valuable, that they deserve full moral respect by virtue of what they are as opposed to what they possess or what they achieve, then does it not follow that they are intrinsically valuable from the point at which they come into being? In that case, embryo-destructive research for putative benefits to others and the abortion of fetuses either for social convenience or because they are defective in some way would be a violation of the most fundamental human right, namely the right to life of innocent human beings. So notice that Robert George, who is a practicing Roman Catholic, is giving here a religious argument. But what makes it religious is not the use of so-called religious language. There is no religious language that he's using. What makes it a religious argument is his religious motivation and the way he situates the argument within a much wider, a bigger framework of moral thinking. In fact, the whole argument of human rights is fundamentally a religious argument. So responding to widespread criticism of his illiberal demand, John Rawls, to his credit, softened his stance and limited his public reason argument to courts of law and government bureaucracies. Jürgen Habermas has also undergone something of a conversion, or partial conversion in recent years. Having ignored religion in his historical account of the development of the public sphere and the organization of modern society, he has come to recognize the role of religious movements and religious voices in the formation of the secular realm. And he has become an outspoken defender of their contribution to the development of human solidarity, as well as in critiquing oppressive social structures and the dominance of reductionist scientism and so on. I would agree that in a procedurally secular state, the language in which legislation, administrative decrees, court judgments are couched must be neutral between competing worldviews. Charles Taylor again. He writes, it's self-evident, this is his argument against people like Rawls and Habermas, it's self-evident that a law before Parliament couldn't contain a justifying clause of the type, whereas the Bible tells us that. And the same goes, mutatis mutandis, for the justification of a judicial decision in the court's verdict. But this has nothing to do with the specific nature of religious language. It would be equally improper to have a legislative clause, whereas Marx has shown that religion is the opium of the people, or whereas Kant has shown that the only thing good without qualification is a good will. The grounds for both these kinds of exclusions is the neutrality of the state. Jonathan Chaplin, a Christian social philosopher in Britain, has helpfully distinguished between what he calls confessional candor in the sphere of representation and confessional restraint at the point of public decision-making. The key question is how the passing of a parliamentary bill or a judicial verdict is officially justified to the public as an act of state. So he writes, faith, both religious and secular, may be explicitly and unashamedly introduced into public deliberations, even formal ones, such as those of a parliament. But it must step into the background when those deliberations move from the representative sphere to the moment of constitutional decision. The representative sphere can and should accommodate a plurality of voices, but when the state speaks as state, it must speak with one voice, the voice of the political community itself, and that community lacks the competence to endorse a particular faith perspective. So, some concluding reflections. All groups in a pluralist society, whether they are called religious groups or secular groups, must challenge their members to be self-critical, to develop what the Jewish political thinker Hannah Arendt once called enlarged mentalities. So that while not called upon to surrender their core convictions that they may hold, they must still be able to practice an empathetic appreciation of other people's viewpoints. Now, whether a group can nurture such an enlarged mentality in its members is a good indication of what that group has to contribute to public life and the common good. Building relationships across barriers of misunderstanding, prejudice, and mutual ignorance will mean that all of us, thoughtful Christians, secularists, Buddhists, or Muslims alike, we need to challenge the extremism of those members in all groups who want to silence the expression of genuine difference. Furthermore, the health of a community, of any political community, will finally depend on the moral character of its citizens. As I said before, the kind of people we are determines the kind of society we will have in the future. Corrupt legislators, unjust judges, and dishonest police undermine the rule of law, and the law presupposes certain moral foundations. The law cannot work by the threat of sanctions alone. A well-functioning democracy requires a solid core of transformed citizens if it is to thrive. Citizens who prize not only the love of freedom, but voluntary self-restraint, a willingness to make sacrifices for the common good and for future generations. Where people admire corrupt leaders, or where people are preoccupied with the cult of private consumption and self-gratification, the bonds of citizenship decay, and so does commitment to any social and political project. There are times when the Church, through its officially appointed leaders, needs to shape public opinion by speaking a prophetic word into a specific national situation. An important aspect of the Church's speech is to disrupt those social harmonies that disguise underlying injustice and discord. These prophetic disruptions force people and governments to face uncomfortable realities, to be disturbed by them. However, church leaders would do well to first listen to those in the church, the so-called laity, who have greater first-hand knowledge of those issues that are being addressed. What Christians ultimately bring to society is a radical love for the stranger, a hospitality, a generosity towards those who are different to us. And this needs to be translated into relevant social and political practices. The church can only defend itself by defending others. In a plural society, Christians secure their religious freedom by advocating freedom for Muslims or Hindus to have the same right to be heard in the continuing conversation about the direction of society that is characteristic of liberal polity in the best sense of that word. And finally, our primary identity as Christians relativizes all our local and national identities without obliterating them. So on any issue, we need to be asking not what is there in this for Denmark, or what is there in this for the USA, or for Sri Lanka, or for China, but is how does this affect the global common good? Moving away from political indifference, from religious chauvinism, from utopian dreams of social harmony, Christians recognize the fragility, the provisionality, and indeed the fallenness of all our political arrangements. As Christians, we are sensitive to the way that the lust for power can subvert every quest for justice and freedom. And yet we are also aware that in the good news of Jesus Christ and in the empowering work of the Holy Spirit, we have the resources to engage the public arena with hope as well as with humility.